Welcome to the Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Janelle Elgaway. And good evening, Call Nation. It's time for your favorite show, The Doctor's Corner. And now your host, Dr. Kline and Janelle Elgaway. Okay, I think we're having some technical difficulties. Janelle, could you turn your mute button on, please?
Here we go. Good evening and welcome to the Doctor's Corner on Call 360 Network with co-host Dr. Kline and I'm Janelle Elgaway. And we are here with special guest Craig, who is a heroin addiction specialist, to discuss the ABCs of addiction. We will also have joining us Jessica to help discuss type 1 addiction. There are two ways to join into tonight's program: through our website, www.callnation.com, or YouTube channel, The Doctor's Corner. Please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get reminders of when we are on live. Dr. Kline loves to hear from you and answer all your questions from our mailbag. If you have future mailbag questions, please email them to janelle.elgaway@caw360.com. If anyone would like to call in with a question this evening, you can do so at 415-403-2715. We will take questions on addiction at around 8:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Kline and Craig to the Doctor's Corner. How is everyone this evening?
I'm just dandy.
Great.
And
I'm doing
Craig?
well too. Thanks.
Okay, excellent.
Go
ahead and the mailbag.
Well, before we start, is there anything newsworthy that has occurred within the last week that you'd like to share with us, Dr. Kline?
The fear of addiction phobia, which is very similar to the fear of being possessed back in 1692, is a very serious hysteria, because in 1692 people became so frightened of being possessed they hung their neighbors. They all lived in small towns, and it wasn't just Salem, it was multiple towns where they hanged their neighbors, including a dog. Most of the people were hanged were older women. So the hysteria in this country on the fear of addiction phobia is doing things like this. In Massachusetts, Section 50 of their general laws has just been amended to include the following: a practitioner, doctor or practitioner, who issues a prescription for a controlled substance which contains an opiate shall be liable to the patient for whom the written prescription was written for the payment of the first 90 days of inpatient hospitalization for their addiction. How do you like that? So if I prescribe something and somebody becomes addicted, they will bill me for the first 90 days in the hospital as punishment. So you see, we're moving away from medical issues into severe prejudice, hatred, and punishment. So here's another one. This article was entitled, America's Opioid Epidemic, Hardest Hit States Identified. Now, if you make a list of the states where they have overdose deaths, they're going to be in a list. And there's going to be a number 1 and a number 2 and a number 3. So the hardest hit states identified, they're the ones at the top of the list. You see, this is information without anchoring it. In other words, maybe the hardest hit states have a teeny weeny problem, but they're at the top of the list. It's like me saying, good heavens, in Cleveland, Ohio, there's 17,000 cats. That's an unanchored piece of information. It's not anchored to anything in reality. So our government, that takes a dim view of dope fiends and addicts, is now trying to block safe injection sites. We're going to ask Craig in a minute what he thinks of this idea of these safe injection sites. But anyway, Pennsylvania is trying to do the right thing for what they think is the right thing for people with addiction disease by setting up. And so the federal government is trying to block that. Let's see, what else do we have? Oh, this is a note from my mother-in-law. I don't want to read that. Let's see. A new piece of information from our wonderful CDC. Fentanyl is the deadliest drug in America. Well, that's because heroin is disappearing from the streets, so I've heard. And fentanyl, that's much cheaper and easier to make, is now hitting the streets. And of course, a certain percentage of folks with type 2 addiction, which we'll discuss in a minute, are going to die because they get the stuff. It's not pure. They don't know how to use it. They make these accidents with the dose. It's with other things. And so we're going to discuss that too, which is the fact that we've spent $1 trillion now on the war on drugs, and we haven't really done very much for treating addiction disease, and it's probably on purpose. Why should we be spending money on these dope fiends? So that's a nice announcement from CDC. So now what's going to happen? So now nobody's going to get any opiates at all. They're not going to get fentanyl, which is a wonderful drug. We give fentanyl to babies. It's that safe. It's a wonderful anesthetic. So in Pennsylvania, they're passing in the House of Representatives in the state unanimously. They're going to restrict the use of fentanyl. I don't know where these people get their information. They're certainly not getting them from doctors. And I doubt they're getting them from the medical societies because they're all sitting under their desk with their hands over their head waiting for the atomic blast to come. And lastly, here's a title of an article on MedPage Today. And by the way, MedPage Today and Medscape are very popular websites for professionals to read and general population. These are blogs. They don't monitor what's going on. There's no peer review. I mean, you could just publish anything you want, And so this starts off with risky painkillers commonly prescribed for osteoarthritis. What painkillers are risky and which ones are not risky? They're all risky to an extent. Matter of fact, all drugs are risky to an extent. Tylenol has a black box warning at the FDA that says, be careful, you may develop Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Now, Stevens-Johnson syndrome is this horrible disease where all your skin falls apart and you get these horrible sores in your mouth and it gets down in your GI tract. It's a terrible, terrible side effect. People are usually hospitalized with it. But does that make Tylenol risky? There's a black box warning on opiates, said you might get addicted. Black box warning on Tylenol, you may end up in the hospital, this horrible skin disease. Risky. So this is the use in like MedPage Today, you see. They have a contributing writer. So the contributing writer is basically a blogger, right, who's taken information from this stuff and is just writing whatever they feel like writing. That's what blogs are. You just write down whatever you want, and then they title it Risky Painkillers. So, we have people like Red Lawhern who follows up on these things and writes them. And I'm glad he does because I don't have time. But you see, this is all part of the problem. And this is occurring every single day. And nothing we're doing is working. So we're going to try something tonight that maybe will start to work. So we have two people on tonight. We have Craig, the specialist on heroin addiction, and we have Jessica, who's going to be calling in right about now. Oh, I forgot. Yes, go ahead. Let's do the mailbag. I blithered on too much. Well, you need somebody more aggressive than me. You know, I'm not good at this stuff. You know, I'm a fact finder. My job is to find facts and give them to people. And then when people say, well, where did you get that? I say, well, here's where I got it. Well, is that true? I said, that's not up to me. I'm giving you the facts. You find it. So we need to meet with people like Josh Stein and have what's called a Socratic discussion. These are very painful and difficult, but this is how Plato described what Socrates taught everyone. Socrates wrote nothing. Plato wrote down what Socrates did. And here's what Socrates would do in the meeting with Josh Stein. He would say, what's the problem? And Josh Stein will say, well, we have all these opioid deaths. And then the next question is, who's dying? Oh, well, I guess people in the general population. Well, that's not what your statistics show. Your statistics show these people are dying in the streets. This is an epidemic of people with opiate addiction dying in the streets because they don't have any medical care. You know, so that's the kind of discussion we need to have. And so it would be nice to have somebody who's a moderator and moderate, both, who can approach him or approach his staff about having a meeting. I always prefer calling the staff because if the boss thinks it's interesting enough, the boss will sit in. When you call for a meeting with a public official, I mean, they get these calls every day, you know, hog farmers want to hear from them and people opposed to pesticides. And so I think of somebody who knows how to talk to people. If we have any lawyers in the group, that would be nice because attorney generals are lawyers. So I think we're going to ask for some help there. I think it's a great idea. I would be happy to go because I live here in Raleigh and, you know, take along my dog and pony show and start to teach people what we're going to try to find out tonight, because this is what's at the key of what's going on. So next question. You know, I mean, if somebody, you know, kicks your dog, you know, you turn them in. If some doctor's kicking you or your spouse or your grandmother by purposely reducing your pain medicines, then you turn them in, you know, period. Generally, when you turn in doctors, generally they become more polite because they've been sanctioned by the board, and we don't like to be sanctioned by the board because they hold control over our licenses. The Board of Registration in North Carolina can come tomorrow with the sheriff and pull my license instantly if they feel I'm a danger to society. That's what their rule is. But if you're turning in people for under-treatment, now under-treatment is a real good word to use because that is never, ever done in medicine. We don't purposely undertreat anybody for anything. Oh, you got a headache? Well, don't take 2 aspirin, take a half of one. You know, you have cancer? Oh, let's just give you half the normal dose of your chemotherapy. You have heart disease? Oh, let's just try half of the diuretic. You know, we don't do that. So that is a good word to use. I am being undertreated. Don't say that you're being tapered, or you can say you were tapered to a point of undertreatment, but they get it. You just say undertreatment. Undertreatment is a negligent thing. And every complaint the board gets, they investigate. You may not hear about it, but the doctor will get a letter. And also, our board here in North Carolina is very sensitive to all this. They even have a statement that they will haul you up before the board if you are engaged in undertreatment. So we have a nice and progressive board here in North Carolina. So doctors need to be turned in. I'm sorry. I'm not going to support my profession when I see egregious, hostile, unprofessional, unethical behavior because they are afraid. That's not why we put on this job. Too bad. People that work down in sewers, are in constant danger of suffocation from not having enough oxygen. They pump oxygen down in these pipes for people. People get caissons disease working in tunnels. I mean, there are risks to every job, and part of the risk to practice in medicine is to take your concerns to other professionals. If you're afraid the DEA is going to raid you, go over to their office and say, look, here's my patients. Are you going to come and raid me? I know you have the right to look at my records. Anytime you want, come over and look at my records. Just don't come in here and take them one day. Go to the board. If you're concerned the board is going to pull your license, go to the board. I actually have patients who've done that. They write the board themselves and say, my doctor is scared to death. And then the board sent them back a nice letter and say, well, tell him he doesn't have to be afraid of anything just because he's doing the right thing and prescribing to you. Doctors have become part of the hysteria. They have become so hysterically frightened, like the general population. So it's sort of this rolling thunder, kind of complete. The only thing that's going to stop it is for people to speak up and report them. So the answer is go ahead. This is a myth. A lot of times during these, times of witches and incantations, myths will pop up. And one of the myths that is used by a lot of surgeons is, if you take too many opioids, it's going to make your pain worse. I've researched this, and it's either extremely rare or it's phony, because it's real simple. I mean, if you get more and more pain with more and more medicine, just reduce the medicine, right? And if your pain's better, wow, you got the diagnosis. People do get weird reactions to opiates and all medicines. So some people can have what we call idiosyncratic reactions, which means unexpected. So if it does exist, you just reduce the medicine. It's not an excuse to not give the medicine in the first place. I mean, that's like saying Humira, which is the world's most popular drug for arthritis, and extremely expensive, will cause lymphoma. How do you like that? As a side effect, it causes lymphoma. Very rare. So do we stop giving people Humira because there's a very rare side effect? No. I mean, we had somebody here in North Carolina get eaten by a shark, killed, Did we close all the beaches? No. So when you have these rare events, you just deal with it and you notify people. If you're going to the beach, watch out for sharks. If you're going to take this medicine, watch out for addiction. And here's what will happen. You're going to just suddenly go to the moon. So that's the answer to that question. Stop. That's it. Just say you have post-polio syndrome, period. You don't give them long lists. The more you list, the more they think you're making it up. And we have a principal diagnosis in our charts. What is the principal diagnosis? First thing, so post-polio. If you have fibromyalgia and migraine headaches and interstitial cystitis, pick the interstitial cystitis, because we're finding out that more and more people have various kinds of manifestations, to their disease. So, yeah, just pick one. I can hear you okay. All right. Well, let me just kind of introduce why we have these two experts on here. All science begins with observation. Pluto was discovered by observing telescope photographs. There was something that moved. Scientists discover all kinds of things by watching animals. They found that when dolphins are courting, the male dolphin brings a string of seaweed and puts it around the girl's neck like a necklace. So how was that? That was discovered by observing. So what I've observed in my limited knowledge with actual people with addiction, but just being a doctor and looking for clues, it struck me that there's two different kinds of addiction. In diabetes, there's a type 1 diabetes that's in children, type 2 is in adults. If you talk to a doctor and you say, I have a person with diabetes, the first question is, which type? Because they're very different and they're treated differently. And it struck me that the same thing is true with addiction. So I am proposing a type 1 and type 2. And the more I personally thought about this, the more it started to explain a lot of things. So I think type 1 addiction is a person who seeks substances to feel better. They asked Kelsey Grammer why he took drugs. He says, because they make me feel better. There's a good book written called The Broken Brain by Maya Salowitz, who's now a prolific writer and supporting of pain issues. And she started off feeling very empty as a teenager, and then she felt better when she got together with her girls, like everybody does, around her 15 or 16. And she said, this marijuana is making me feel really good, and I feel really crappy in my life. So that was a good example. People type 1 will seek substances that make them feel better. Since we as doctors only have antidepressants, which really don't make people feel better, unless you have a true clinical depression, actually they make you feel worse. So we don't have any tonics. We don't have any things that make you feel better. Marinol is coming along in some states, and if you're sick, it does make you feel better. That's why people take it. So the drugs involved with type 1 addiction are basically marijuana, cocaine, 95% of alcoholics, and amphetamines / Adderall, stimulants. People can become addicted to these. My definition of addiction for these folks is involvement with substance that ruins your daily life. If you're smoking weed every single day and you're going to work and you maintain a family and you have a lover, everything is fine. You don't have addiction by my definition. You just have heavy use of substance. So once that happens, then you got a problem. Disease, D-I-S, means dis. Ease means you're ill at ease. That's the definition of a disease. If somebody comes to me with an abnormal lab study and they're not sick and I can't find anything on examination, I don't consider them having a disease. They have an abnormal lab result. Same thing with the big four in the type 1 addiction. The other thing is that people can stop without having a withdrawal in this group, even though they don't want to stop, because, as Kelsey Grammer said, it's making me feel good. The problem with type 1 addiction is the most dangerous in terms of crime. The most serious crimes, and I remember asking Craig this a long time ago, are actually committed by people on alcohol. So if you take people in prison, and very few people with heroin addiction end up in long-term prison, the people that end up in prison are people that commit crimes. So who is it that's committing drug-related crimes? Number 1, alcohol. Number 2, cocaine. Number 3, amphetamines. Because both cocaine and amphetamines and alcohol change your personality and can turn you into a real dangerous person. If there's anybody who's a fiend, it's going to be in type 1 addictions. Type 1 addictions are what you read about when you read, people with addiction disease have all these bad psychosocial backgrounds. Just type 1, that's true. Type 1 folks tend to do well in talk therapy. They do not do well with medicine therapy. They frequently can get rid of their addiction that's ruining their daily life and be perfectly normal the rest of their lives. There is a brain mechanism for type 1, and it has to do with reinforcement. Maya Salowitz got to the point where she was shooting cocaine 40 times a day, and then she just stopped. And she went to rehab, and she found a very good therapist. And lo and behold, they started addressing the basic problems for which she was trying to feel good about by shooting, all this cocaine and making her feel good like every 5 seconds. So that's reinforcement. Now, if you look at heroin addicts, they're very different. So I've put heroin addicts into type 2 addiction, different definition. Yes, it's ruining their life, but more importantly, type 2 addiction is intense seeking without regard for consequence. And that's actually a definition that Craig and I worked out a couple years ago, and I think it still fits. Type 2 addiction is clearly a genetic brain disease. 700 papers published. Genetic tests are going to be available shortly. FDA is speeding up the process to approve these tests. It's going to be able to detect whether or not you have the genes for addiction. Well, that means there are genes for addiction, or else there wouldn't be a test for it. This is not true in type 1. Everybody says, addiction runs in their family. Well, cigarette smoking runs in families, and eating too many donuts runs in families. That's not it. Type 2, there's real family associations. Not every addict has a positive history, and not every family produces, addicts, but it's pretty strong. And the studies have shown very high correlations that there are several people in the family. There are other type 2 addictions that involve your brain receptors, and the other one is nicotine. And the last one is 5% of alcoholics. 5% of alcoholics have a withdrawal. So now we're kind of describing type 2 addicts as having withdrawals. So obviously anybody on opiates is going to have withdrawal. So if you're addicted to opiates, you're going to have withdrawal. Nicotine, very serious withdrawals, almost as bad as heroin, but in a more miniature version. And people with alcohol receptor disease addiction in this type 2, if you take them off alcohol, they will die. I had a chance to meet Jerry Garcia before he died at a concert because I was the physician there. And he was in search, when I met him, of quarts of whiskey. So he had a serious problem. And then I read that he went to rehab outside of San Francisco, and 3 days later he was dead. So you know what? When you take people off alcohol, abruptly, 3 days later, they're usually dead. So with the 5% of people with true alcoholism, and that means somebody who needs the substance nearly around the clock, and that's true for nicotine and for opiate addictions. You need the stuff all the time. Type 1 addictions, you can go out and drink, 2 cases of beer on the weekend, and then you go to work. Or somebody who's shooting cocaine can't get any, so they're okay. They just wait a couple of days until they get some more money or find another source. So when you start to look at the parameters and the brain mechanisms, it really does look like there are 2 distinct types of addiction. Now that's important because every one of the pain patients, the 28,000 people that follow me on Twitter, and 93% of them have chronic pain, are in trouble because they're assumed to be addicts or become an addict. And this is a popular thing, I have patients whose children are talking to their parents saying, don't take this stuff. You're just going to turn into an addict. Well, this is not true, because one of the peculiar things about type 2 addiction is it occurs on the very first pill or first injection. 8% of people who have heroin addiction do start with heroin, but that's neither here nor there. It's an opiate. And the opiate creates the big blast of euphoria immediately. There was a recent article in People magazine about Jamie Lee Curtis, said she was an addict. And, I see that a lot. So I read the story. And lo and behold, she had never had an opiate. So it was the first exposure. And she said she just went to the moon. And she immediately started intense seeking. She started swiping it from her sister and blah, 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 and doing the light duty crime that people with addiction disease do. And I failed to mention of the serious crimes that occur with type 1 addicts. At the bottom of the list was heroin and marijuana. So heroin and marijuana have the least number of serious crimes, and that is something that very few people know. People assume that heroin addiction is associated with violent crime, thanks to the United States government helping to produce the film Reefer Madness. The U.S. government narcotics squad helped produce that film that portrayed people on narcotics, which was actually marijuana, as killers, shooting people, running over people and driving off, becoming licentious, women seducing boys from the high school, boys from the high school seducing women. And this was all in one little 45-minute movie. So maybe people don't remember the movie, but people remember the fear of the disease. So it's 8:30, and so we want to hear from our two guests, and we want to hear from people with questions for our guest. And we're going to start with Craig. And Craig, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. First of all, thanks, Dr. Kline and Janelle, for having me. I definitely appreciate that. My name is Craig, and I'm from Northeastern Ohio. I suspect, Dr. Kline, that I might be on your list of states with a lot of opiate overdoses. Actually, I don't mean to make light of that. I know it's true. Unfortunately, I've had to bury quite a few friends. But whether circumstance or environment, it's just been a thing in this area. I know that there are other areas in the country that have, been hit hard as well. But the reality is I've been able to, help people with that problem, to help them, get off of heroin and opiates. And I've mainly dealt with, as you would say, the type 2 addicts, the ones who, seek intensely, and regardless of consequence, just seem to keep doing it over and over. They're either in a treatment center or halfway house, or back in jail for a little bit, and they come out, and that process tends to repeat itself over and over. Like I said, I've had the opportunity to be able to meet a lot of these folks and to help them with their problems so they can get their life back. And it's funny that you mentioned Reefer Madness, because I think in the media portrays these people with their children in the car, overdosing, and don't get me wrong, that definitely happens. But this idea that if you're a heroin addict, that you live in under a bridge or in an alley somewhere, it just really is not the case. A lot of the people that are addicted to heroin are your neighbors and your coworkers and your members of your family and friends. And in many cases, and in some cases you wouldn't know it or suspect it. But it's not something that, in my opinion, that can be maintained long term. So eventually, people find out because, for whatever reason, you do end up having to go to rehab, or you lose a job, or you get divorced, or any number of things that, the opiates or the heroin or fentanyl, whatever it happens to be, obviously causes those types of issues. So,
why do addicts, why do type 2 addicts end up in jail? What's the commonest reason?
Usually a couple of reasons. One, they may nod out behind the wheel and get in an accident. That is pretty frequent occurrence. or they're just, driving erratically, and, they're still conscious and they get pulled over. And it's pretty obvious that they're under the influence of something. And then probably the biggest thing that they get arrested for is shoplifting. And, places like Target, Walmart, those types of places tend to have a lot of, shoplifting by heroin addicts. In other words, they're basically trying to take that merchandise and either trade it for opiates or sell it outright if they can to get money for opiates.
Yeah, that's what in the studies that I read that we just quoted, it seems that the crime with the typical dope fiend, as we joke, which is the heroin addict, usually is shoplifting, manipulating doctors. It seems to be, well, according to that study, it's not involved with serious crime. Jessica, you're on the line, and Jessica has an interesting position, and I'll have her described a little more. She kind of grew up in Baltimore, which is my home city, and we were always proud of the fact that Baltimore was one of the few cities that sold Velveeta cheese on the gourmet counter. And so it's a blue-collar town. It's got a lot of rough sections, and Jessica had a lot of interesting observations about people. She herself was not involved with addiction of either type, but was kind of an observer. So, Jessica, tell us a little bit about your time in Baltimore.
Hi, Dr. Kline, and thank you and Janelle for having me as well. My time in Baltimore, I was actually 16, and I was on my own. Coming from North Carolina, I ended up being out on the streets. So I ended up running in with a lot of people, and most of them were around my age, and they were already doing a lot of different drugs. I saw a lot of drinking. There was a lot of fest. They would do things, like mixing in cocaine or just straight opium with marijuana and smoking it that way. They would do it without other people knowing. I've seen exactly what Craig was talking about with Walmart. You can do petty theft. And the thing with that is you can take it right back to Walmart. As long as you have some type of photo ID, Walmart has it to where you can return the merchandise and get the money back. They just give you the money back without the receipt. And you can do that 3 times a year. So they would go to an adult who was also addicted to, something like heroin or crack cocaine, and they would get an adult to return the merchandise. So I've seen a lot of drug use as growing up.
What was the most popular drug amongst kids your age?
Definitely marijuana.
Okay. And did you see a lot of deviant behavior, people smoking marijuana? Criminal type behaviors?
I did, honestly. I saw a lot of people where, they would get high and they would go just key someone's car. Or they would pick up, trash cans and then just knock them over. To them, it was funny. They would do anything and just start laughing, but it wasn't anything serious. I saw the more serious crimes when, I noticed a lot of heroin addiction. And heroin would, if they ran out, that was it. They would go insane doing anything that they could to get it.
Mm-hmm. What percentage of people did you think had heroin addiction versus the entire population of drug users? By the way, I don't use the word abuser or misuse because those are judgmental words. It's somebody using substances and maybe using too much, but they're using. So of the people using various substances, what percentage of those do you think were really hooked on heroin? Or is that hard to say?
75, about 75 to 80% is really easy for me to say.
Okay, so
It was mostly heroin.
So 75% were on heroin, 25% were on these other various agents.
Correct.
So you were
actually,
you were in a serious drug neighborhood.
I really was. I lived in a very rough section of the city. And, actually my son's father, his father died in an alley. And he was addicted to heroin and he had AIDS. He died in an alley because he overdosed.
Yeah. So Craig, so it sounds like Jessica was in a real hardcore, heroin neighborhood. My position as a doctor is if somebody comes to me and they say people are dying from an overdose, then I want to do something about it. And not just say that they deserve it, because they made poor choices. And as we're talking, we know that type 2 addiction is a real brain disease. It's a mu receptor brain disease, what I used to call and still like to call a chemical receptor disease. The same as the special alcoholics, same as cigarette smokers. They have chemical receptor diseases. But I want to figure out why people are dying. The CDC's information about 40,000, 15,000, who knows, they're revising it all the time, people dying, as far as I can see, 95% of these are heroin addicts. So we got 40,000 heroin addicts dying a year. Why don't we take care of the problem of heroin addicts dying? And Craig, what do you think there's a place for hard information, maybe on a secure website, for people using heroin where they can ask professional people, pharmacists, doctors, nurses, medical questions? What do you think that's a waste of time or wouldn't work?
It may. It's hard to say. I mean, I know that there was a website. I don't know if it's still out there or not. Blue Light, I think, is the name of it, where drug addicts would ask other drug addicts questions about drugs and doses and potency and stuff like that. Adding the element of having professional people from the medical community or just people that are knowledgeable about the subject. On that type of website, it certainly could, but I think most of the people, if they do have questions, they'll, more than likely ask their friends that are using. And so sometimes that information is accurate and sometimes not, unfortunately. It's hard to say. I mean, it couldn't hurt. Let me put it that way. I don't think it could hurt anything.
I think if we started out and people would trust the confidentiality, I'll give you an example. It's very common for people who die from overdose, whatever it happens to be, who are taken to the medical examiner. The needle is still in their arm. Now, what that's telling me as a doctor, and what I remember from my training in anesthesia, is when you're giving IV morphine to somebody prior to anesthesia, you do it slowly. Because if you squirt in all the IV morphine, you're going to suppress people's respiration and they're going to die of suffocation. So the fact that addicts come in with the needle still stuck in their arm is telling me they injected too rapidly. Now, are folks on the street aware of this, Craig, of this fast injection being a problem?
I don't believe so. I mean, a lot of the people that I know don't have access to, people like yourself that are knowledgeable on the subject from a medical standpoint. You would think that, well, hey, if you're able to, procure syringes and fill them up and not die the first time, that you know what you're doing. And but a lot of that again is, it's people that are already doing it, teaching other people how to do it. And I don't think the teachers have a medical license in the process. I'm pretty confident that they don't. And that is actually, interesting that you should say that, because I've heard a lot of stories about that, where, the needle is still literally in. It basically kills them before they have a chance to pull it out.
Yeah, it's too fast. Jessica?
Anecdotal.
Yeah. Jessica, did you find in your experiences that people were kind of teaching each other, all the tricks of the trade and really had no access to medical folks?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They would try to teach each other how to do certain drugs, the different ways that you could do them. And they really had no idea of what could happen if things went wrong. They didn't have access to health care. I know I personally didn't have health care for 6 years at all. And these kids didn't either. And the adults didn't. They didn't feel they needed to pay for it unless something went absolutely wrong. And then they would just go to the emergency room. But they were always trying to teach each other how to do the drugs the different way, how to melt things down, the quickest way to get a high.
Gotcha.
So absolutely, he's right.
This reminds me of back in the 50s when we had a lot of young women from high schools ending up dead at the abortionists because abortion was illegal. And so they would go off to some crooked doctor somewhere, and they would get an infection or bleed to death because they had no medical care. They were, shuttled off to distant places. But the problem was that young women in high school were getting pregnant because they were teaching each other about sex and not getting it from professionals. So, for example, it's very popular going around amongst, young teenagers and stuff who were starting to have sex, that the first time you have sex, you're going to be fine. You're not going to get pregnant the first time you have sex. So this is the kind of information that was passed within the social group. The problem is these social groups are very powerful. Young teenagers, 14 and 15, especially girls, they've got their own world, I mean, I went the other day and gave my granddaughter, age 14, a big hug. Just, grab hair, don't do that. I mean, they want to be in their own little group. And Craig, and you've, I'm sure, noticed this in I call it the heroin community because it becomes a community. Or am I all wet on that?
No, it's definitely a community. It's funny because I used to think, where are all these heroin addicts coming from? And now I know, they run together and they do have their own little world. And the only time it's really exposed to, we would consider the outside world or reality is when there's like a jolting shock, something happens, someone dies or overdoses or has an accident of some sort. And now all of a sudden, the other real world comes in to, invades that junkie or addict's world, because it does become very, very small. And, the people that are in it, they're usually, they know each other and, they run with each other. And, that's been my experience. I can't speak for everyone, but, just from my observations, that's what I've seen.
Yeah. And Jessica, same thing with your experiences with the groups, that it was just these enclaves of mutual support. I think it's like buddies in the military. People become very close because they're involved with danger and they're kind of protecting each other from the danger of overdose or danger of being caught or whatever. And so you were part of this group, even though you were not using street drugs, but so you were still accepted?
I was. I mean, when I came around the group, and someone mentioned family in the chat, and it's more, we became family. And
Okay.
I'm still friends with all people today, to be honest.
Interesting. Yeah, okay.
But any rate, yes, they did accept me. I was from the South and I was new to the neighborhood. And because my boyfriend, well, no, son's father now, was in the group at the time, he kind of headed it up. I was accepted instantly. I did have to fight a couple of girls, to be completely honest with you. Um, but other than that, it was kind of, that's how I proved myself. And they respected the fact that I did not want to get high. I mean, they did try to get me to do a lot of things. And, for the most part, that didn't happen. I tried marijuana and that just didn't sit well with me. I was, one of those people who just sat there and had the red eyes and wanted to laugh and eat. So it just wasn't something I enjoyed. But after that, they loved me and I loved them.
So very powerful social group knit together with drugs or without. It's like teenagers that get together and they like a certain kind of music or whatever. We want to take some questions. We're kind of blithering on. And Craig, I want to ask Craig if he would like to tell us more about his background.
Sure. Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to ask that question. Yeah, I've actually been, clean off of heroin myself personally for 11 years now. I did get involved with it and, had a lot of the serious issues that come along with addiction, specifically heroin. And I was doing other drugs as well, but heroin is really, I think the physical addiction part of it, and it really, really is the thing that got to me. And, so for about 2 to 2.5 years, I was, in my mind, forced to stop a couple of times, either by family or now I'm sitting in a rehab center. And I felt like I was forced to stop. But I didn't want to. I was the type that sought it out intensely, regardless of consequence. And in my mind, I knew that it's, what I was doing was not right. It didn't feel right. I didn't want to do it, but I had to. I had to. And fortunately for me, I ran into a group of people that had similar backgrounds, but that weren't drinking or doing drugs or heroin anymore, and they were able to help me. And so they like I like to say, they spoke my language. So I could relate to their stories and their experience, and they were able to help kind of drag me out of my own hell, really. And I'm grateful for that. And and because of that, I've gotten the opportunity to help other people as well. And I count a lot of my closest friends as heroin addicts that are off of it, and have been for quite some time. The story that you become addicted to heroin and you die or you go to prison. I mean, obviously those things do happen, but that is not the only case. And in many cases that doesn't occur. And so I've been fortunate enough to not only survive that and learn a lot about it, but again, have been able to, impart some knowledge and experience in other people so they don't have to go through that hell. I grew up in the suburbs. I was very judgmental myself about people that used heroin or, used drugs intravenously. And I always said that wouldn't be me until I came across heroin, and then that became me. And, all the things that, they said would happen eventually did. I just, for whatever reason in my mind, didn't think. I thought that, well, I'll be able to control this somehow. And that is a mistake I've found by talking to lots of people that a lot of people make. They think they'll be able to handle it. They say they've seen the stories in the news and that won't happen to them. And then it happens to them. And so I have a lot of friends that have struggled with this thing. They're still alive. They're not in prison. They're not on parole. They're not on probation. And yet they, try as they might, they just aren't able to stay clean long term. They may be able to get a month or two under their belt, and the next thing I know, they're calling from the hospital or from jail or from a halfway house or treatment center.
And then you go and see them, right? And are supportive when they're in
Yeah.
the hospital or wherever. Yeah, that's wonderful. Do you remember the very first time you became involved and had your first, I don't like the word high, um, but when you had your first ecstasy, or we say magic carpet ride or going to the moon, do you recall that? And was it abrupt with your first exposure?
The very first time in my life, or with heroin specifically?
Well, the first time that you felt the big high, the ecstasy, the wonderful feeling.
Yeah, that was with alcohol as a teenager.
Okay. And what was it like? I mean, I feel pretty good when I have a couple of beers, but what was it like when you had a couple of beers?
I felt like God himself handed me a magic elixir that
Yeah.
that took away everything. And I guess, yeah, you could call that a moonshot for sure. Like my first rational thought after not believing how good I felt was, I can't believe that everyone that has access to alcohol isn't drinking it all the time. I
Yeah.
remember distinctly thinking that.
And you see, that's because not everybody has the genes, but kids don't know that. And this is part of what we want to teach kids. So now we can take some calls and we can run over a little bit because this is a big topic and we've got two kind of experts here to help answer questions. So any question you have is fair game.
Okay, and we do have one caller right now. I just want to remind everybody, if you do want to call in, the number is 415-403-2715. Okay, caller from area code 203. What's your name and welcome to the Doctor's Corner. What's your question?
Hi, it's Shirley. I'm calling because recently I wouldn't say accused, but I've been asked to try Suboxone because I was on higher amounts of opioid medication, and it's kind of distressing. And it led me to file a complaint today with the DOJ website under civil rights, and I'm wondering where that's going to get me.
No, one of the things is when and this was a statement from the famous William O. Douglas, who was the longest reigning Supreme Court person. And he said, if you're going to be civilly disobedient, you need to be prepared for the consequences. So that's how you do it. During the civil rights movements, people were prepared for the consequences, retaliation, being dragged off in the woods and hanged, being shot with fire hoses and jailed. So this is part of the courage of speaking up when something is wrong. So if you've got the courage to do that, that's great. And you mentioned Suboxone, so I wanted to ask Craig a question. The Suboxone is on the street. It's told to us doctors that you can't get high from it. Is that true?
No, that is 100% false.
That's what I thought.
As a matter of
If
fact,
go ahead.
Easy to smuggle into jail, so it's very prevalent in jails and prisons because of its form. It's very small, it's very powerful. I have a friend that was his drug of choice, was Suboxone.
Okay. And can you get really high from it? Can you get euphoric and shoot to the moon?
Absolutely.
All right. So you see, if you really want to find out stuff about drugs, you ask people on the street because they know, and all of us doctors sitting behind our little desks, we don't know. But the caller, Suboxone is a wonderful opiate, or it wouldn't be abused on the street or used on the street. There I go, slipping with the abuse word. And it is an excellent, excellent painkiller. So doctors are prescribing it. I haven't figured out why. It's got something to do with money. And it's got something to do with you can get a license from the DEA for 160 patients. And I don't know if they get more money for it. But with the way things are, I'm telling my patients, if they get offered Suboxone for their pain, go ahead.
But it doesn't work for my pain.
Oh, it didn't work? Oh, crap. Did you take enough?
No, they gave me that Belbuca. No, did nothing but take away withdrawal symptoms.
Oh, geez, that's too bad. Now, it's true that all opiates have different effects. I mean, this is all doctors who use this. Some people doesn't work, and some people go, have terrible side effects. But in general, Suboxone is a good drug for everybody. Both addicts and pain patients need to have opiates, and neither one of them wants to do without, So it doesn't really matter which one it is. What about a methadone, Craig? That's another drug that's you don't get high from that. Yes, thank you for calling. Methadone,
yeah,
Craig, do you think that's... Do people
I know people that have I know people that have used it as intended to basically stave off withdrawal. And then I also know people that have abused it. In other words, they initially were prescribed it to, maintain, but they ended up figuring out a way to abuse it. And then in many cases, would go back to heroin or fentanyl. If they were doing things that, that, or, maybe they had other rules and regulations along with the methadone that you had to follow in order to keep it. Do
you think the average street addict knows? Yeah. Do you think the average street addict knows it takes 5 days for methadone to kick in?
No, I didn't know that either.
Okay, you see here again.
I know that the withdrawal is very difficult.
So a bad withdrawal, but see, this is how people die on the streets, and a lot of people are dying from methadone because they're taking it like it was oxycodone or heroin. Like, it's just it takes 5 days to work. So they just keep taking it, and 5 days later, all of a sudden, oh my God, you've got this horrible blood level. So you see, there is, we need to expand blue light. We need to have doctors and, of course, still heroin addicts, kind of hashing it out and saying, did you know it takes 5 days for methadone? Oh, no, I didn't know that. All right, well, be careful then, instead of saying, well, don't take it. No, just be careful. So do we have another caller? Yes. Yes.
It's Jess. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I actually know. And I know a lot of people who currently abuse methadone.
Okay.
And my ex-boyfriend passed away from it. He ended up nodding out, while he was eating, and he passed away. But that was when they call it wafers. They're blue and they're large. That's it was a pill form that they used to come in. They know that it does take a while to kick in.
Okay.
The people that I do know, and it is a problem, a huge problem, because that and Suboxone are heavily sought after on the streets.
Okay. Interesting.
Just wanted to put that in.
Yeah, no, excellent. No, that's very interesting. Another caller?
Yes, caller from area code 971. Welcome to the Doctor's Corner. What's your name and what's your question?
Hi, my name is Joy, and I know it absolutely has to do with chemistry because I'm a chronic pain patient, was on the same medication, same dose for over 22 years till I was abruptly stopped. Didn't go to the streets for drugs. I just went through terrible withdrawals because my primary doctor would only put me on the buprenorphine or whatever that part of the box. Yeah, okay, that's what she can only give me, she says. Well, my son is a full-blown meth addict. Had to get him out of the state we live in to another state because he kept chasing that chase and running with the same crowd. Well, he is in a clean and sober house. But that's why it has to be chemistry, because why does my grown son have the addiction? I don't have the addiction. My ex-husband is an alcoholic. So it's got to be chemistry.
It is chemistry, you are correct. And most people have a protection against becoming addicted to type 2 addiction, which is, heroin, opiates, alcohol, and some small percentage of alcohol and cigarettes, because the brain chemistry is different. And also, the brain researchers are discovering that the receptors themselves have different affinities, which means some drugs will really latch on to the receptor and some don't. So some people may have a more severe addiction, type 2 addiction to heroin, than others. So it's a lot harder for some people to come off, and they relapse more. But then they're said, oh, so you don't have enough willpower. No, it's got to do with the disease, So
Right.
yes, and it does run in families, although, and technically amphetamines we're temporarily putting into type 1, which is a kind of behavioral addiction. It's still an addiction if it's ruining your life, but it's not the same brain hardwired addiction that occurs with heroin. So,
Yeah,
but
I don't
that's,
think he.
go ahead.
As Craig does, I don't ever think he shot heroin because he never shot drugs, but he did do heroin before because he told me. He said, Mom, I did do heroin. I didn't shoot it. I think he just chased anything he could chase.
Right. In other words, he's probably a type 1 addict, does not have the chemical receptor disease. So for those kinds of people, when they take heroin, they're just going to feel a little drowsy, a little pleasant, but they're not going to have that shot to the moon that Craig was talking about. I mean, this is an incredible feeling. And people don't have any idea how incredibly wonderful this feeling is. And we have to understand that's a biochemical phenomenon. It's got nothing to do with the person. This is the loss of protection that our brain has for becoming addicted to our own, drugs our brain makes. So do we have another caller? That was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nope. We have no more callers this evening.
Okay. Well, just a couple of comments to wrap up. Jessica, what would be your ideal intervention for people who have addiction, type 1 addiction, as we define it, as your life being ruined? Now, how many of the people did you see that had, they were running around keying cars and living it up and, goofing off? How many of those people do you think their lives were actually being ruined?
I honestly know that 4 out of 17 were ruined.
Okay. So that's
one is he's addicted, unfortunately, to prescription painkillers now.
Okay. So he's a type 2. Yeah.
Exactly. I have another who's a type 2, and 2 more ended up in jail. They were twins.
Okay, and was that with type 2 with opiates?
They were selling drugs.
Okay, all right, different story. Yeah, so, one of the things I was going to try to do here in North Carolina, if we do get in and meet with Josh Stein, is to set up a website like Blue Light. Blue Light is only addicts, and maybe set up a little better one that involves professionals, but also people with addiction disease. And we said before that type 1, as soon as you fix things and you solve your life's problems and you stop shooting your IV cocaine, you go back to having a normal life. But with heroin addiction and type 2, you do not ever go back to having a normal life because you've got the brain abnormalities that are going to be there forever. And this is why folks that have incredible courage to try to deal with this brain malady that do get off, they still relapse a lot. And then, of course, they feel terrible. But that's part of different difficult addictions. I used to smoke cigarettes. It took me 9 tries to get off cigarettes. That's a type 2 addiction. I used to sneak butts. That's intense seeking. It's like a little mini heroin addiction. So, Jessica, do you have a last comment about if I gave you an unlimited amount of money, which is pretty much floating around, what would you do with it in terms of your type 1 addictions and type 2 addictions?
I would honestly set up something for education. We really need to focus on educating our teenagers, our children. They are completely unaware. We were talking, Jonelle mentioned this, had a similar experience where, my son thought he got a female pregnant because he kissed her, thanks to the, misinformation of children in school. But the same thing is happening with drugs and alcohol. And these kids, they get to where they want to try it. They want to see if what their peers are saying is true. So we really need to focus on education. So if I had unlimited funds, I really would focus on doing that, going around and educating our teenagers and talking about that and setting up centers for, the people that are older, who are addicted, like, our parents who have alcohol addictions. What can we do to help them? That's something that I don't see anyone really trying to help, honestly.
Well, and as we mentioned, alcohol is related to serious crime. Deaths from alcohol is 5 times the number of deaths from opiate overdose. And there is, by the way, a wonderful YouTube video by Claudia Christensen, who was on Star Trek, actress, and she gives a real good description of a type 2 alcoholic and how this blocker called naltrexone or Vivitrol really saved her life. You just take one pill in the morning, and you go out and have a glass of wine, nothing happens. And they did try this drug in opiate addicts, but Craig, have you had any experience with Vivitrol in the community, naloxone?
Not personally, I didn't. I think it was just coming out as a treatment for heroin addiction when I got clean. But I know that a lot of other people have taken it. It's typically something, and this may have changed, but for a while, it was if you got arrested with some kind of drug charge, part of the sentence, you could reduce your sentence.
Oh, I see.
If you did Vivitrol for 12 months. And these guys, a lot of them are type 2, they use because it, they feel like they have to, but it also makes them feel better. And so they realize that, this is a once a month shot. And so the reason why you have to get it every month is because it starts to wear off. And I actually have a friend of mine who was in like an intensive outpatient program, and a gentleman who was in that class with him actually overdosed and died because it was coming up time for him to get his next Vivitrol shot, and he knew it, and he knew that he could probably do heroin again, and because he wanted that feeling again, or felt like he needed to have that feeling again, and the Vivitrol didn't act as a blocker, and he literally died in the classroom.
And there's another piece.
So that's an anecdotal story, but
but it's an important one, because there's another piece of medical information as a doctor that I would like to tell people, and that is about biochemical tolerance. You got to take more and more to get up there, and then when you go back down, you're going to need less to get the same high. People talk about how much to get a high. Well, wait a minute. If you've been off for a while, you're going to get the same high with less. And if you don't take less, you take too much, and then it's curtains. So, more what would you do if you had an unlimited amount of money, Craig? Somebody just, here, the government said, here, do whatever you want.
2 things. I'd like to echo what Jessica said about education. The education I got about drugs and alcohol came from my friends, if it did at all, or, from my school, who basically said that drugs are really, really bad. Don't take them. They'll ruin your life. And, my experience, the first time I drank or got high was not that. It was the opposite. And I thought, well, why were they lying to me about it?
Ooh,
education, to me is important, but it has to be real.
Honest.
And you, and you had mentioned, when we had spoke about, singling out those kids, like if you do this or when you do this, if this is your reaction, you should have some kind of avenue or outlet to let people know, like, oh, I might have this thing, and we need to monitor that and keep it in check, because, my first reaction was I knew it was abnormal. I knew it was. I said, I don't think other people feel this way when they drink. And so I'm 14 years old, and so I don't want to tell anyone. I don't want to tell my parents. I don't want to tell a teacher. I'm like, well, how can I get more of this? And I'm probably going to have to steal it or manipulate people to get it for me. And so I can't tell anybody about that because I feel like they'll take that away from me. And so
right away So immediately at age 14, you became intense seeker.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It basically took everything over in my life immediately.
And you see, it's not your fault, Craig. See, that's the sad thing. People have this notion that at 14 you were some kind of something was wrong with you and you were making a bad choice. You were not making a bad choice. The addiction started accidentally, really. A lot of kids drink beer when they're 14, but only 4 per 1,000 is our official number. So you got 1,000 friends, only 4 of them would be like you and have this reaction. One final comment that I thought was kind of amusing about sex education is somebody was saying her 19-year-old daughter said, the reason we didn't listen to sex education in school is because we all knew that sex was really fun and wonderful. And then they were painting this picture like, oh, this is all bad. And she said, as soon as teenagers find out they're being lied to, then they don't listen to anything else. Exactly what you just, So education needs to be, we'll start some film strips, and education and treatment and websites all need to have people with addiction on them so that they can answer questions honestly.
Sure. No, and I like the treatment ideas. So a lot of times people won't even know that there are people addicted to heroin around them until they end up either in jail or in a hospital. And so having treatment options there, because it's like, how do you go find these heroin addicts? They seemingly don't exist until they end up somewhere. And so I had a friend who overdosed twice in the same day, like literally the same paramedics brought him from the gas station to the hospital twice. And they Narcaned him, of course. And as soon as he was stable, the hospital cut him loose. And I thought, he's going to die,
Yeah, well.
Yeah.
These are bad people. And that's why we need to have more folks like yourself on. We talked about type 1 addiction as kind of people that have problems and stuff. But type 2 addiction is a cross-section of the country because it's genetic and it's sort of accidental. He went to the doctor and he got addicted right away. Wait a minute. He went to the doctor and he got addicted on the first pill? First 2 pills? So maybe it's not the doctor. Maybe this is the triggering of addiction as opposed to creating addiction in type 1. So I really appreciate both of you coming on the show. And I don't really have any final comments. It's time for my evening donut, so I need to get going. And Janelle, do you have a wrap?
Yes. Well, again, Dr. Kline, I would like to thank Jessica and Craig for joining us this evening on the Doctor's Corner. I also wanted to mention, don't forget, this Sunday, March 31st at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Call 360 has a new show coming out called DPP Rally Talk Show with Claudia Morandi. And you will be able to find that on YouTube under DPP Rally Talk Show with Claudia Morandi. We don't have it up yet. Or on our website, www.callnation.com. And again, a big thank you to our audience for taking some time out of your evening to join us here at the Doctor's Corner. I'm Janelle Ogwe with Dr. Kline signing off until next Tuesday. Have a great evening.
Good night.
This has been The Doctor's Corner with Dr. Kline and Janelle Elgoway. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved.